They were planning to declare me incompetent and steal everything I'd worked for my entire life. The words still make my hands tremble as I speak them. Have you ever felt so betrayed that your own heart seemed to stop beating? Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for just 1 second, feel that this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Judith Ashbrook. I'm 67 years old, and I live in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago, where the autumn leaves now carpet my front yard like golden prayers scattered by the wind. The house around me feels too large, too silent, echoing with memories that both comfort and haunt me in equal measure. 10 years ago, I was Dr. Judith Ashbrook, one of the first female cardiologists in the city, spending my days saving hearts while unknowingly breaking my own family apart through absence and misplaced priorities. This morning, like every morning for the past decade, I sit in my favorite armchair by the window, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. My worn leather Bible rests open in my lap, the same one my mother gave me when I graduated medical school, its pages now soft as silk from countless readings, its margins filled with prayers whispered in desperation and thanksgiving. The golden letters spelling Judith on the cover have faded, but the promises within remain as bright as ever. I reach for my coffee cup with hands that once performed delicate heart surgeries, hands that are now lined with age spots and tremor slightly from a lifetime of carrying burdens too heavy for one woman to bear. The ceramic is warm against my palms, a small comfort in a house that has grown colder with each passing year since my husband Erwin's sudden death from an aortic rupture. An irony that still cuts deep, since I spent 35 years repairing hearts just like his, yet couldn't save the one that mattered most. The silence is broken by the buzz of my phone against the mahogany table beside me. My heart leaps with hope. Maybe it's one of my children, Gar or Emily, calling just to say good morning, just to check on their mother who gave them life and sacrificed her own dreams to provide for theirs. But as I reach for the device with trembling fingers, my stomach already knows what my mind refuses to acknowledge. This won't be the call I've been praying for. The screen displays Emily's name, and for a moment, my heart soars. My daughter, my beautiful Emily with her father's gentle eyes and my stubborn determination, is reaching out to me. I answer with a breathlessness that betrays my desperation for connection. Mom. Her voice is flat, businesslike, lacking any warmth or genuine concern. No, good morning. No, how are you feeling? No acknowledgement that I might be lonely or struggling or simply human. We need to talk about the house situation. Gar and I have been discussing it, and we really think it's time for you to make some decisions about your living arrangements. The words hit me like ice water. Living arrangements. As if my home of 40 years, the place where I raised her and her brother, where I held them during nightmares and celebrated their achievements, where I mourned their father and learned to live with the crushing weight of widowhood, as if all of this was simply a living arrangement to be optimized like a business transaction. Emily, sweetheart, I begin, my voice catching on the endearment that feels increasingly hollow each time I use it. I'm perfectly fine here. The house is maintained. I'm healthy. I can take care of myself. I don't understand why. Mom, you're 67 years old. You're living alone in a house that's too big for one person. What if something happens to you? What if you fall? What if there's an emergency? The practiced concern in her voice doesn't quite mask the underlying impatience. The sense that she's rehearsed these arguments countless times, probably with her brother and their spouses, plotting in my absence about how to handle the mom problem. I want to remind her that I was a doctor, that I understand medical risks better than most people, that I've faced life and death situations with steady hands and clear thinking for decades. I want to tell her that I've been taking care of myself and others since before she was born, that I don't need to be managed like an invalid or a child. But something in her tone warns me that this conversation isn't really about my safety or well-being. It's about something else entirely, something that makes my chest tighten with a familiar dread. Have you been looking at the brochures we sent? She continues, and I can hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of efficiency and organization that I once admired in my daughter, but now fills me with cold fear. Sunset Manor has excellent reviews, The residents there are very happy. You'd have your own apartment, but with staff available if you need assistance. And think about how much easier it would be. No more worrying about maintenance or yard work or all those empty rooms. Empty rooms. The phrase echoes in my mind like an accusation. The rooms aren't empty. They're full of memories. Of Christmas mornings when the children were small and believed in magic. Of birthday parties and graduation celebrations. Of quiet evenings when Erwin and I would sit together reading while the children did homework at the dining room table. These rooms hold the architecture of my life, the physical spaces where love was given and received, where a family was built one day at a time through ordinary moments that seemed unremarkable then, but feel precious beyond measure now. Emily, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make any changes right now. This house is my home. It's where your father and I— Mom, Dad's been gone for 10 years. The words are sharp, cutting through my sentence like a blade designed to sever emotional attachments. You can't live in the past forever. At some point, you have to be practical about your situation. My situation. Another clinical phrase that reduces my life, my grief, my complex emotions and deep roots to a problem requiring solution, an inconvenience requiring management. I feel tears threatening behind my eyes, but I blink them back, unwilling to let my daughter hear the weakness in my voice that might confirm her apparent belief that I'm too fragile to make my own decisions. Through the window, I watch my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, walking her small dog, the same routine they've followed for the 8 years since she moved to the neighborhood. She waves when she sees me in the window, and I lift my hand in response, grateful for even this small acknowledgement of my existence. Mrs. Patterson is also a widow, also in her late 60s. But her children visit regularly, bringing grandchildren who play in her backyard and help her plant flowers each spring. The contrast between our lives feels sharp and painful, a reminder of what family relationships could be when built on genuine love rather than obligation and financial calculation. I need to go, Emily, I say finally, unable to bear the conversation any longer. I'll think about what you've said, but I'm not making any promises. This is my home, and I have the right to decide where I live. There's a pause, a silence that feels charged with unspoken frustration and perhaps something darker. Of course, Mom. Of course you have the right to decide. We just want what's best for you. We love you, and we worry about you being all alone in that big house. We love you. The words should bring comfort, should fill the hollow spaces in my heart with warmth and reassurance. Instead, they feel empty, automatic, like the kind of phrase people say because it's expected rather than because it's true. When was the last time either of my children said those words and meant them? When was the last time they called or visited without some underlying agenda, some request for money or favor or assistance with their own lives? After I hang up, I sit in the growing silence of my living room, surrounded by photographs that document a life that seems increasingly distant from my current reality. There's the picture from Gar's wedding 12 years ago, where he looks handsome and confident in his rented tuxedo, his arm around a bride who has since learned to view me as an obstacle rather than a family member. Emily's graduation photo from law school shows her beaming with pride and possibility, back when she still called me regularly just to share the details of her day. But those versions of my children, the ones who hugged me tight and said, "I love you, Mom," with pure sincerity, feel like strangers now, replaced by adults who measure our relationship in terms of what I can provide, rather than who I am or how I'm feeling. I reach for my Bible again, letting it fall open to a passage in Psalms that has brought me comfort during the darkest moments of the past decade. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The words blur slightly through the tears I can no longer hold back, but I read them aloud anyway, my voice barely a whisper in the empty house. Outside, the afternoon light is beginning to fade, casting long shadows across my living room floor. Soon it will be evening, then night. Then another day of waiting for phone calls that bring obligation rather than love, for visits that feel more like business meetings than family gatherings. But for now, I sit with my Bible and my cooling coffee, praying for strength I'm not sure I possess, and hoping for a miracle I'm afraid might never come. The memories came flooding back as I sat there in the gathering dusk, each one a testimony to the sacrifices I'd made in the name of love, sacrifices that now felt like fool's gold, shiny and valuable from a distance, but worthless when examined closely. I remember when Gar was 25 and called me at 3 in the morning, his voice thick with panic and shame. He'd been arrested for drunk driving, and the bail was $5,000. Money he didn't have, money that would have taken him months to save from his entry-level marketing job. I didn't hesitate. I drove to the police station in my pajamas and slippers, my checkbook clutched in my trembling hands, and posted his bail without asking a single question about how he'd gotten himself into such a situation. "Thank you, Mom," he'd whispered as we drove home in silence, his head hanging in shame. "I'll pay you back, I promise, every penny. I just need some time to get back on my feet." That was 15 years ago. The $5,000 was never mentioned again, never repaid, seemingly forgotten by everyone except me. Instead, it became the first deposit in what would become a lifetime account of unacknowledged debt, each withdrawal made with promises that were as empty as the space where gratitude should have lived. Then there was Emily's divorce 5 years ago, when her husband left her for his secretary. A cliché so painful it felt like a knife twisted in an old wound. She came to my house with her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, both of them hollow-eyed and broken, carrying nothing but a few suitcases and the weight of a shattered life. I opened my door and my heart without reservation, turning my guest bedroom into a sanctuary where they could heal and rebuild. For 8 months, they lived with me. I cooked their meals, helped Lily with her homework, held Emily while she cried through the long nights when the divorce papers arrived and the custody battles began. I paid for her lawyer, an expensive family attorney who promised to protect her interests and ensure she received a fair settlement. $12,000 later, Emily walked away with half of everything and full custody of Lily. "I don't know how to thank you, Mom," she'd said the day they moved into their new apartment, the one I'd helped her secure with first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit that drained my savings account by another $6,000. "You saved our lives. I'll never forget this." But forget she did. Within months, the daily phone calls stopped. The spontaneous visits became rare, then non-existent. Lily's drawings, the ones she used to make for Grandma Judith and taped to my refrigerator, stopped coming. Even the thank you cards ceased, replaced by silence that spoke volumes about how quickly gratitude can turn to expectation, how easily love can transform into entitlement. I pulled out my reading glasses and reached for the stack of photo albums I kept on the table beside my chair, the ones that documented decades of birthdays and holidays, graduations and celebrations. Each page told the story of a mother who gave everything she had, who worked 60-hour weeks as a cardiologist to pay for private schools and family vacations, who sacrificed her own dreams and desires to ensure her children had opportunities I'd never had growing up in a working-class family where luxury meant having enough food for the entire month. Here was Gar's high school graduation, where I'd surprised him with a brand-new car, a Honda Civic that represented 3 months of my salary, purchased because I wanted him to feel proud walking across that stage. Wanted him to start college with the confidence that came from knowing his mother believed in his potential. He'd hugged me so tight that day, promising he'd make me proud, swearing he'd use every opportunity I'd given him to build something meaningful with his life. The car lasted 2 years before he totaled it in an accident that was entirely his fault. I bought him another one. Here was Emily's college graduation from Northwestern, where she'd studied pre-law with my encouragement and financial support. $60,000 in tuition, room, and board, money I'd saved by working extra shifts at the hospital, by taking on consulting work during my rare vacation days, by living in the same modest house while my colleagues bought vacation homes and luxury cars. The investment had seemed worthwhile when she graduated summa cum laude, when she spoke at commencement about the importance of giving back to the community, about using privilege and education to help others. But law school required another $40,000, and then the bar exam preparation course, and then the professional wardrobe for her first job interviews. Each expense was presented as an investment in our shared future, a temporary hardship that would pay dividends when she became a successful attorney and could support herself independently. I wrote the checks willingly, proudly, believing I was purchasing my daughter's happiness and security. Now she was indeed a successful attorney. earning more in a year than I'd made in 3, living in a beautiful house in Lincoln Park with granite countertops and hardwood floors. Yet somehow, my financial obligations to her had never ended. They'd simply evolved, transformed from education expenses to family emergencies that required immediate assistance and brooked no discussion of repayment. My fingers traced the edges of a photograph from last Christmas, the most recent family gathering we'd managed to coordinate. Gar and his wife Vanessa had driven in from Milwaukee, where he worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. Emily and Lily had come for dinner, though Emily spent most of the evening checking her phone and making excuses about early meetings the next day. The conversation had been stilted, formal, filled with the kind of careful politeness that characterized relationships between strangers rather than family members. But even that awkward dinner had ended with a request. Vanessa had pulled me aside in the kitchen, her voice low and conspiratorial as she explained their temporary cash flow situation. Gar's company was restructuring, and his commissions were down significantly. They were struggling to make their mortgage payments, and the bank was starting to send threatening letters about foreclosure proceedings. "We hate to ask," Vanessa had said, her eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine tears, "but we didn't know where else to turn. Gar's so proud he'd never admit we're in trouble, but I'm scared, Judith. I'm scared we're going to lose everything we've worked for. $8,000. That's what it took to bring their mortgage current and buy them time to figure things out. I wrote the check that night, telling myself it was an investment in my son's marriage, in his stability and happiness. Vanessa had hugged me with what felt like real warmth, promising they'd pay me back as soon as Gar's commission situation improved. That was 11 months ago. The subject of repayment had never been raised again, despite the fact that Gar had received a promotion 6 months later, a development I'd learned about through a Facebook post rather than a phone call sharing good news with his mother. I closed the photo album and set it aside, feeling the familiar ache in my chest that came whenever I allowed myself to really examine the pattern that had defined my relationship with my children for the past decade. Give, give, give. Money, time, emotional energy, unconditional support, and receive nothing in return except increasingly elaborate requests for more assistance and increasingly creative explanations for why previous debts could never be repaid. The house felt especially quiet tonight, the silence broken only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock Erwin had bought for our 25th wedding anniversary. He'd been so proud of that clock, explaining to anyone who would listen that it was a tempus fugit, time flies, in Latin, and that he wanted something in our home that would remind us to cherish every moment we had together. If only we had listened to its wisdom. If only we had spent less time accumulating wealth and status, and more time actually being present for the people we claim to love most. Maybe if I'd worked fewer hours, attended more school plays, been available for more bedtime stories and weekend adventures, my children would see me as more than just an ATM with emotional attachments. I reached for my Bible again, letting it fall open to Matthew 7:11. "If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" The verse that had once brought me comfort now felt like a mockery, a reminder that my own gifts to my children had been received without gratitude, without love, without any recognition of the sacrifice they represented. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, a different interpretation began to emerge. Perhaps this verse wasn't about earthly children at all. Perhaps it was about my relationship with my Heavenly Father, about the way God continued to bless me despite my own failures and shortcomings, about the way divine love operated without conditions or expectations of repayment. The phone rang again, startling me out of my meditation. This time it was Gar, his voice bright with false cheer as he launched into what I immediately recognized as another carefully rehearsed request for financial assistance. "Mom, how are you doing? We've been thinking about you so much lately, wondering how you're managing in that big house all by yourself." The words were almost identical to Emily's from earlier, and I realized with a sinking heart that they'd coordinated their approach, probably discussing strategy like attorneys preparing for a difficult case. The thought that my own children viewed me as an adversary to be managed rather than a mother to be loved sent a chill through my bones that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the old windows. "We're fine, Gar," I said quietly, my voice betraying none of the pain that was tearing through my chest like physical trauma. "What can I do for you?" As he began his explanation, something about Vanessa's mother needing surgery and their insurance not covering all the expenses, I found myself praying silently, desperately. God, am I being tested or just forgotten? The question hung in the empty spaces of my heart, waiting for an answer that didn't come. The weeks that followed felt like watching my own life through frosted glass. Everything blurred and distorted, familiar shapes becoming unrecognizable shadows. Small cruelties began accumulating like dust in corners I couldn't reach, each one seemingly insignificant alone but collectively suffocating in their weight. My 67th birthday arrived on a Tuesday in October, the kind of crisp autumn day when the air smells like dying leaves and wood smoke, when the light slants golden through windows and makes even sadness look beautiful. I woke up with the foolish hope that still lived somewhere deep in my chest, the stubborn maternal optimism that insisted my children would remember, would call, would somehow acknowledge that this was the day I came into the world and gave them life. I made myself a special breakfast: blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, the expensive kind I usually saved for when company came over. I brewed my favorite coffee and arranged everything on my best china, the Wedgwood pattern my mother had given me as a wedding gift. If no one else was going to celebrate my existence, I would do it myself with whatever dignity I could muster. The phone remained silent all morning. I checked it repeatedly, making sure the ringer was on, that I hadn't somehow missed a call or message. By noon, I'd convinced myself they were planning something special, that the silence was intentional, building toward a surprise that would make the waiting worthwhile. I showered and put on my nicest dress, the navy blue one with small pearl buttons that Erwin had always said brought out my eyes. At 3 o'clock, I drove to the grocery store and bought myself a small chocolate cake from the bakery section, the kind with pink roses made of frosting and happy birthday, written in cheerful script across the top. The young clerk who rang up my purchase smiled and said, "Someone's having a celebration." I smiled back and said, "Yes, someone is," though the words felt like shards of glass in my throat. I ate dinner alone at my dining room table, the cake sitting in front of me like an accusation. I lit a single candle. 67 would have been too depressing, too visual a reminder of all the years that had passed without bringing me the love and respect I'd spent a lifetime trying to earn. The flame flickered in the gathering dusk, casting dancing shadows on the walls where family photographs watched me celebrate alone. At 9:47 p.m., my doorbell rang. My heart leaped with such desperate relief that I nearly ran to the door, smoothing my hair and checking my reflection in the hallway mirror. They hadn't forgotten. They'd come. My children, my beautiful children, had remembered their mother's birthday after all. I opened the door to find Gar, Emily, and little Lily standing on my porch, arms full of gift bags and bright smiles. Emily carried a bakery box that undoubtedly contained a cake far more elaborate than my simple grocery store purchase. Gar held flowers, pink roses, my favorites, though I wondered if he remembered that detail or if it was just lucky coincidence. "Surprise!" they chorused, and I burst into tears right there in the doorway. Not from joy, but from the overwhelming relief of not being invisible, of mattering enough to merit this effort, this attention, this proof that I hadn't been completely forgotten by the people I loved most in the world. "Oh, Mom, don't cry," Emily said, though her voice carried a note of impatience rather than sympathy. "We wanted to surprise you. We've been planning this all week. All week." The phrase should have comforted me, should have demonstrated thoughtfulness and care. Instead, it made me wonder why none of them had called during that week of planning, why I'd spent my actual birthday in solitude if they'd been organizing a celebration all along. But I pushed those thoughts aside, desperate to enjoy whatever affection they were willing to offer, however belatedly. We gathered in my living room, where I'd spent the day reading and trying not to watch the clock. They'd brought gifts: a soft scarf from Emily, expensive skin cream from Gar, and a hand-drawn card from Lily that depicted our family as stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. It was the most beautiful thing I'd received in years, and I clutched it to my chest while they sang Happy Birthday. in voices that almost sounded genuinely happy. The cake was indeed elaborate. 3 layers with chocolate ganache and fresh strawberries, the kind of dessert that cost more than I typically spent on groceries for a week. We ate it while they told me about their lives, about Gar's new project at work, and Emily's latest case, and Lily's upcoming school play. For an hour, maybe 2, I felt like part of a family again, like a mother whose opinions mattered and whose presence brought joy rather than obligation. But then, as we sat around my coffee table with empty cake plates and the debris of wrapping paper scattered on the floor, Gar cleared his throat in the way he always did before delivering news he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "By the way, Mom," he said, his voice taking on the carefully casual tone that I'd learned to recognize as a warning signal, "Vanessa and I have been looking at some opportunities, investment opportunities that could really set us up for the future. There's this franchise opportunity that just opened up in Milwaukee, and the returns look incredible." My stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. This was it. This was why they'd come, why they'd brought cake and flowers and theatrical displays of affection. Not because they loved me, not because they'd wanted to celebrate my birthday, but because they needed something from me again. And they'd calculated that a surprise party would soften my resistance to whatever request was coming. "It's a coffee shop franchise," Emily chimed in. And I realized they'd coordinated this presentation just as carefully as they'd planned the fake celebration. The initial investment is substantial, but the location is perfect, right near the university campus. College students are always looking for places to study, and coffee shops have such stable revenue streams. $45,000. That's what they needed. $45,000 for a business venture that Gar admitted he knew nothing about, in an industry where failure rates exceeded 80% in the first 5 years. But the opportunity was time-sensitive, and they needed an answer tonight. Needed the funds transferred first thing Monday morning, or they'd lose their chance at financial independence. I looked at my granddaughter Lily, who was coloring in a book at my kitchen table, completely absorbed in her artwork, and blissfully unaware that the adults in the room were treating her grandmother like a personal bank, rather than a human being worthy of love and respect. She was the only pure thing in this house full of lies and manipulation, the only person present who seemed genuinely happy to see me. "I need time to think about it," I said finally, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. $45,000 is a significant amount of money. I'd need to review my finances, maybe talk to my financial advisor. "Of course, Mom," Gar said quickly, though I could see frustration flickering behind his eyes. "We completely understand. It's just that the timing is crucial, and we've done all the research. This really is an incredible opportunity, and we wanted to include you in it because we know how important family is to you. Include me." As if investing my life savings in their risky business venture was a privilege they were graciously extending, a chance for me to participate in their success rather than simply fund their latest scheme. The language was so carefully chosen, so perfectly designed to make exploitation sound like generosity, that I felt sick to my stomach. They stayed another hour, making small talk and maintaining the pretense of familial affection, while the real purpose of their visit hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. When they finally left, hugging me goodbye with embraces that felt mechanical and rehearsed, I stood in my doorway watching their taillights disappear into the darkness and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. This wasn't love. This was performance. Carefully scripted and expertly delivered, designed to extract maximum financial benefit while providing minimum emotional investment. They'd staged a birthday party not because they cared about me, but because they needed me to feel grateful and indebted when they made their request. Every smile, every hug, every word of affection had been calculated to serve their purposes rather than express genuine feeling. I walked back into my living room, where the remnants of our celebration were scattered across my coffee table like evidence of a crime. The expensive cake seemed obscene now, its elaborate decorations a mockery of real thoughtfulness. The gifts felt like bribes, tokens offered to purchase my compliance rather than expressions of love. But it was Lily's drawing that broke my heart completely. In her innocent artwork, we were all holding hands, all smiling, all connected by the invisible bonds that should have held our family together. She'd drawn the world as she wanted it to be, not as it actually was, and I realized that I'd been living in the same fantasy, desperately wanting to believe in a version of my children that existed only in my imagination. I sat down heavily in my chair and reached for my Bible, letting it fall open to Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? The words seemed to speak directly to my situation, to the way I'd deceived myself about my children's motives, to the way I'd confused their greed with need and their manipulation with love. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every interaction from the evening, analyzing every word and gesture for signs of authenticity I knew I wouldn't find. The house felt different around me, not like a home filled with happy memories, but like a stage set where performances were given for audiences of one, where love was something that could be purchased rather than earned. In the darkness, I whispered a prayer that felt more like a confession. Lord, I think I've been blind. I think I've been loving people who don't love me back. I don't know what to do with that truth, but I can't pretend anymore that what we have is real. The silence that followed wasn't comforting. It felt expectant, like the moment before thunder breaks, like the pause before everything changes forever. And somewhere deep in my bones, I knew that change was coming whether I was ready for it or not. 3 days after the birthday charade, I discovered something that changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no shouting match, no moment of explosive revelation. It was the kind of quiet discovery that happens when you're not looking for it, when truth accidentally reveals itself through the smallest of details. I was in my basement, looking for my winter clothes in the storage room behind the furnace, when I heard voices drifting down through the old heating vents. The house was built in 1952, and whoever installed the ductwork had created an accidental intercom system that carried conversations from the living room directly to the basement with startling clarity. Over the years, I'd overheard countless phone calls, arguments between Erwin and myself, and the children's whispered secrets when they thought they were alone. But this conversation was different. This conversation was about me. They were all there. Gar, Emily, their spouses Vanessa and Daniel, gathered in my living room for what they'd told me was a family meeting to discuss holiday plans for Thanksgiving. I'd excused myself to use the restroom and decided to grab a sweater from downstairs since the October evening had turned chilly. Instead, I found myself frozen on the basement stairs, listening to my children discuss my future as if I were already dead. "She'll sign eventually," Gar was saying, his voice carrying the confident tone he used when closing sales deals at work. "She's getting more confused, more dependent. Did you see how she reacted to the birthday surprise? She was so grateful, so emotional. She's becoming easier to manage." Easier to manage. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and leaving me clutching the wooden banister for support. They weren't talking about caring for me or protecting me. They were talking about controlling me, about reducing me to a problem that required management rather than a person who deserved respect. "I still think we're moving too slowly," Emily's voice cut through the darkness, sharp with impatience. "Every month we wait is another month she could change her mind, could get suspicious, could talk to someone who might give her ideas about fighting us. We need to accelerate the timeline. Daniel's contact at the Psychiatric Evaluation Center is ready whenever we give the word," Vanessa said, and I felt ice form in my veins. One assessment showing cognitive decline, maybe some evidence of paranoid thinking or financial incompetence, and we can have her declared unfit to manage her own affairs. The house, the investments, everything would transfer to conservatorship. Conservatorship. A legal term that sounded so clinical, so reasonable, but what they were describing was theft. Systematic, calculated theft of my autonomy, my dignity, my very identity. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could seize control of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd saved, everything that represented my independence and security in my golden years. "What about the neurologist she mentioned?" Daniel's voice carried a note of concern. "What if she actually gets evaluated by someone legitimate, someone who won't cooperate with our assessment? She hasn't made any appointments," Emily said dismissively. "I checked with her primary care physician's office. Dr. Henderson's receptionist is a friend of mine from law school. Mom hasn't scheduled any neurological evaluations, hasn't asked for referrals, hasn't shown any signs of fighting back. She's exactly where we need her to be, dependent, grateful, and trusting. The casual violation of my medical privacy should have shocked me, but I was beyond shock now, existing in a state of numb disbelief that protected me from the full emotional impact of what I was hearing. Emily had used her professional connections to spy on me, to monitor my medical decisions, and ensure I wasn't taking steps that might interfere with their plans. The retirement home contracts are ready, Gar continued, and I could hear papers rustling as he consulted what sounded like a thick folder of documents. Sunset Manor has a lovely one-bedroom unit available immediately. We've already put down a deposit and filled out the admission paperwork. Once we have conservatorship, we can sign her in without requiring her consent. They specialize in residents with cognitive issues, so they're equipped to handle any resistance she might offer initially. Resistance. They were expecting me to resist, which meant they knew what they were doing was wrong, knew I would fight it if I understood what was happening, but they'd calculated that I was too trusting, too lonely, too desperate for their affection to see through their manipulation until it was too late to stop them. And the house? Vanessa asked. Already have a realtor lined up, Emily answered. Based on current market conditions, we should be able to get close to $400,000, maybe more if we stage it properly and wait for the right buyer. Split 3 ways after expenses, that's over $100,000 each, plus whatever we can liquidate from her investment accounts. 3 ways, not 4 ways, not 5 ways to include me or little Lily in the distribution of my own assets. 3 ways, Gar, Emily, and apparently Vanessa, though Daniel seemed to be an active participant in the planning process. They'd divided up my life's work among themselves with the casual efficiency of people discussing dinner arrangements. What about the old woman herself? Daniel asked, and I realized with growing horror that he was talking about me, referring to me like I was an object to be disposed of rather than a human being with feelings and rights. What's our story for how she ended up needing full-time care? People are going to ask questions, especially her church friends and the neighbors who see her functioning normally. Gradual decline, Emily said smoothly, and I could hear the lawyer in her voice, carefully constructing a narrative that would withstand scrutiny. We'll start mentioning to people that we're worried about her memory, her decision-making ability. Maybe she's been repeating herself more often, forgetting appointments, showing signs of paranoia or confusion. By the time we make it official, everyone will think we're being responsible children who waited as long as possible before taking necessary action. Paranoia. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed out loud there in the darkness of my basement. They were calling me paranoid while actively conspiring against me, while plotting to steal my home and my freedom and my very identity. If I started acting suspicious now, if I began questioning their motives or protecting my assets, they would use that perfectly reasonable response as evidence of mental illness. Timeline? Gar asked. 6 weeks, maybe 8, Emily answered. We need to be careful not to rush it, but we also can't afford to let her get comfortable with the idea of staying in the house. The psychiatric evaluation is scheduled for next Tuesday. She thinks it's just a routine geriatric assessment that her doctor recommended. Dr. Phillips owes Daniel a significant favor, so the results are predetermined. Next Tuesday. In 5 days, I was supposed to attend what I'd been told was a routine checkup to ensure I was aging healthily, maintaining my cognitive function and emotional well-being as I entered my late 60s. Instead, it was going to be a rigged evaluation designed to provide legal justification for stealing everything I owned and locking me away in an institution where my protests would be dismissed as symptoms of dementia. The voices above me continued planning my destruction with the methodical thoroughness of people who'd done this before, who understood the legal system well enough to exploit its protections for vulnerable elderly people. They discussed forged signatures, falsified medical records, bribes and threats, and all the small corruptions that would be necessary to transform me from an independent woman into a ward of the state under their control. I sat down heavily on the basement steps, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight as the full magnitude of their betrayal finally settled into my consciousness. These weren't my children anymore. They were strangers wearing familiar faces, using voices I'd heard saying, "I love you, Mommy," to plan my destruction with clinical precision. The conversation above me eventually shifted to other topics: holiday plans that didn't include me, vacation destinations they'd be able to afford once my assets were liquidated, investment strategies for the money they were stealing from their own mother. I sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, listening to them discuss their futures built on the foundation of my imprisonment. When they finally left, calling out cheerful goodbyes that sounded obscene after what I'd overheard, I remained in the basement until their car engines faded into the distance. Only then did I trust myself to climb back upstairs, to face the house that suddenly felt contaminated by their presence, filled with the echoes of words that couldn't be unheard or forgotten. I walked through my living room, touching the furniture they'd been planning to sell, looking at the walls they'd been measuring for liquidation value. Every object in my home had been transformed from a cherished possession into a line item on an inventory sheet, reduced to its monetary worth rather than its emotional significance. In my bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept my important documents: birth certificate, marriage license, Erwin's death certificate, my will, my medical records. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, but now I understood that my privacy was an illusion, that my children had probably been through these papers countless times, copying what they needed for their legal maneuvers and falsified assessments. I picked up the framed photograph of Gar and Emily from their college graduations, the one where they stood on either side of me with their arms around my shoulders, their faces glowing with pride and accomplishment, and what I'd believed was genuine love. Now I wondered if even then, even in that moment of celebration, they'd been calculating how much my support was worth, how much they could extract from me before I became more useful as an incompetent ward than as a functioning mother. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed with an intensity I hadn't felt since the day Erwin died, pouring out my heartbreak and confusion and desperate need for guidance to a God who suddenly felt like my only ally in a world gone completely mad. "Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking on the words, "would Jesus forgive this too? Should I forgive again? How many times must I turn the other cheek before I'm allowed to protect myself? How much must I endure in the name of love?" The silence that followed felt different this time. Not empty, but expectant, like the pause before dawn when the whole world holds its breath waiting for light to return. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just peace, but strength. Not just faith, but clarity. They thought I was easy to manage. They thought I was weak, confused, dependent on their approval, and desperate for their affection. They were about to discover how wrong they were. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing down everything I'd heard, every detail of their conspiracy transcribed in the careful handwriting that had once documented medical procedures and patient histories. If they wanted to play games with my mind, I would prove that my memory was sharper than they assumed. By dawn, I had filled 12 pages with their exact words, their timeline, their accomplices, their financial calculations, the psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Rai, Phillips on Tuesday, the retirement home deposit already paid, the realtor already selected, the division of my assets among themselves, every cruel detail preserved in black ink on yellow paper, evidence of a betrayal so complete it took my breath away. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed proof they couldn't explain away, couldn't dismiss as the confused ramblings of a woman they were claiming had lost her mental faculties. I needed to be smarter than they thought I was, more strategic than they expected. Monday morning, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I called in sick to my weekly volunteer shift at the hospital. Instead, I drove to downtown Chicago and found myself sitting in the waiting room of Morrison & Associates, a law firm that specialized in elder law and estate protection. I'd found their advertisement in the phone book while searching for attorneys who handled cases involving financial exploitation of seniors. The lawyer who met with me was younger than my children, probably 35, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with elderly clients who needed extra time to explain complicated situations. His name was Marcus Chen, and when I told him I needed help protecting myself from my own family, he didn't seem surprised or skeptical. He simply pulled out a fresh legal pad and said, "Tell me everything." For 2 hours, I laid out the entire conspiracy while Marcus took notes and asked clarifying questions that demonstrated he understood both the legal implications and the emotional devastation of what I was describing. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with the same careful attention I'd once given to complicated surgical cases. "Mrs. Ashbrook," he said finally, "what you're describing is elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and potentially several other serious crimes. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Do you want to file criminal charges, pursue civil litigation, or are you looking for protection and prevention strategies?" The weight of the decision felt enormous. These were still my children, despite everything they'd done, despite the complete absence of love or respect in their treatment of me. Somewhere deep in my heart, the mother who had once kissed their scraped knees and sung them lullabies was still hoping this was all a terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved with conversation and forgiveness. "I want to protect myself," I said carefully. "I want to make sure they can't carry out their plan. But I also want to understand why they're doing this. Want to give them a chance to explain themselves before I take irreversible action." Marcus nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Many of my clients feel the same way initially. Family relationships complicate everything, even when the abuse is clear-cut. But I need you to understand something important. What they're planning isn't just morally wrong, it's criminal. And if they succeed, reversing the damage will be extremely difficult, if not impossible." He explained the steps I could take immediately to protect my assets and my autonomy, change all my passwords and banking information, revoke any medical or financial powers of attorney I might have granted, document everything with timestamps and witnesses, install security cameras in my home to record any future conversations or confrontations. Most importantly, he said, don't attend that psychiatric evaluation on Tuesday. Cancel it immediately, and make sure to document that you're canceling it voluntarily, not because you're avoiding legitimate medical care. If they've corrupted that particular doctor, going through with the evaluation could provide them with the fraudulent assessment they need to move forward. I left his office with a thick folder of legal documents and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since overhearing their conversation, I felt like I had some measure of control over my own fate, some ability to fight back against people who had underestimated both my intelligence and my determination. But first, I had to be absolutely certain about what I'd heard. Despite Marcus's advice, despite the evidence of my own ears, part of me still hoped I'd misunderstood something, that there was an innocent explanation for words that had sounded so damning in the darkness of my basement. Tuesday morning, I called Dr. Phillips's office and spoke to his receptionist, a cheerful woman named Karen who had always been friendly during my previous visits. "Hi, Karen. This is Judith Ashbrook. I need to reschedule my appointment today. Something unexpected has come up." "Of course, Mrs. Ashbrook. Let me check Dr. Phillips's calendar. I have to say, your son Gar was so thoughtful to arrange this evaluation for you. He seemed very concerned about your well-being when he called to set it up." My hands tightened on the phone receiver. "Gar called to set up my appointment?" "Oh yes, just last week. He explained that the family had noticed some changes in your memory and behavior, and he wanted to make sure you received a thorough evaluation. He even offered to pay for any services that weren't covered by insurance. Such a devoted son." The words confirmed everything I'd overheard and more. Not only had they arranged the fraudulent evaluation, but Gar had apparently laid groundwork with the medical staff, planting seeds about my supposed cognitive decline before I even arrived. They'd been manipulating the narrative for weeks, maybe months, preparing everyone around me to accept their version of events when the time came to implement their plan. "I see," I managed to say. "Well, I'm feeling much better lately, so I think I'll hold off on any evaluations for now. Thank you for understanding." "Of course. Should I put you on the calendar for next month instead?" "I'll call back when I'm ready to reschedule," I said, ending the conversation before Karen could ask any more questions that might reveal how much I knew about their scheme. That afternoon, I took another step that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. I drove to the nearest electronics store and purchased a small digital recording device, the kind designed for students to record lectures but perfectly capable of capturing conversations between adults plotting against their mother. If they wanted to meet in my house, to use my living room as their conspiracy headquarters, then I would document every word they said for future legal proceedings. I also bought a security camera system that could be controlled from my smartphone, tiny wireless devices that could be hidden throughout my house to record both audio and video of any future gatherings. The young man who sold me the equipment seemed puzzled by a 67-year-old woman's sudden interest in surveillance technology, but he explained the installation process with patient thoroughness and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about my motivations. Installing the cameras felt like preparing for war, like admitting that my own home had become a battlefield where I needed protection from people who should have been protecting me. I placed one in the living room bookshelf, camouflaged among my medical textbooks and family photographs. Another went in the kitchen, hidden behind a decorative plate on top of the refrigerator. A third was positioned in the dining room, concealed within a flower arrangement that had been a Mother's Day gift from Emily 3 years ago. A gift that now felt like evidence of how long this deception had been building. Wednesday evening, as if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, Emily called to suggest another family meeting. "We want to follow up on our conversation from last week," she said, her voice bright with false warmth. "Maybe we could all come over Thursday night. I could bring dinner, and we could spend some quality time together while we discuss your future plans." Quality time. Future plans. The euphemisms made my stomach turn, but I agreed to the meeting with a calmness that surprised me. "That sounds lovely, dear. What time works best for everyone? 7 o'clock? That gives everyone time to get off work and grab dinner. I'll bring that Chinese food you like from Golden Dragon." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen and felt a strange sense of peace descend over me like a warm blanket. Tomorrow night they would gather in my living room for what they believed would be another session of manipulating the confused old woman who trusted them completely. Instead, they would create a permanent record of their conspiracy, documented in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio that would be admissible in court proceedings. I spent Thursday preparing like a general planning for battle, but a general armed with faith rather than weapons, with truth rather than deception. I prayed throughout the day, not for revenge, but for wisdom, not for their destruction, but for their redemption, not for my victory, but for God's will to be done regardless of the personal cost. "Lord," I whispered as evening approached, "give me strength to face whatever happens tonight. Help me to act with love even when confronting betrayal. And if this is the end of my relationship with my children, help me to bear that loss with grace." At exactly 7 o'clock, they arrived with warm smiles and takeout containers, looking like any normal family gathering for dinner and conversation. Gar carried the food while Emily brought flowers. White lilies that seemed appropriate for a funeral, though I doubted she'd chosen them with that symbolism in mind. Vanessa and Daniel followed, and even little Lily was there, skipping up my front steps with the innocent joy of a child who had no idea that the adults around her were about to destroy her grandmother's life. As we gathered around my dining room table, sharing spring rolls and sweet and sour chicken, I watched my children with new eyes. They laughed at appropriate moments, asked polite questions about my health and activities, complimented the taste of the food as if this were just another pleasant family dinner. But I could see the calculation behind their smiles, the impatience lurking beneath their casual conversation. They were waiting for the right moment to strike, confident that they had me exactly where they wanted me, grateful for their attention, dependent on their approval, completely unaware that I knew what they were planning. They had no idea that every word they spoke was being recorded, that every gesture was being captured on video, that the confused old woman they thought they could so easily manipulate had already contacted an attorney and was building a case that would destroy their conspiracy completely. But most of all, they had no idea that their mother, the woman they had underestimated so completely, was about to remind them that she hadn't survived 35 years as a surgeon by being weak, confused, or easy to defeat. The reckoning was coming, and I was ready for it. The moment came 47 minutes into dinner, right after we'd finished the main course and I'd served green tea in my best china cups. Gar cleared his throat with that familiar sound that had once meant he was about to share exciting news about school or work, but now served as a warning that manipulation was about to begin. "Mom, "We've been talking as a family," he started, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who'd practiced this speech multiple times. "And we're really concerned about you living alone in this big house. The incident last week really scared us." Incident. I kept my face carefully neutral while my mind raced to understand what he meant. There had been no incident last week. I'd been perfectly fine, had followed my normal routine of grocery shopping, volunteering at the hospital, attending my weekly Bible study group. But apparently they'd manufactured something to justify their intervention. "What incident?" I asked quietly, sipping my tea with steady hands while the cameras hidden throughout my dining room captured every word, every facial expression, every gesture that would soon serve as evidence in court proceedings. Emily leaned forward, her lawyer's training evident in the way she constructed her response. "Mrs. Patterson called us, Mom. She said you seemed confused when she saw you in your front yard Tuesday morning. You were wandering around in your bathrobe, looking lost, asking her what day it was." Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who barely spoke to me beyond polite waves when we encountered each other getting our mail. The idea that she would call my children to report concerns about my mental state was so absurd it was almost comical, except for the calculated cruelty of using her as a fictional witness to my supposed cognitive decline. "Mrs. Patterson called you?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far they'd taken this fabrication. "I wasn't aware you had her phone number. She found our numbers in Dad's old address book," Gar said smoothly, the lie flowing so easily I wondered how many others he'd told over the years. "She was really worried, Mom. She said you didn't recognize her at first, and when she asked if you were okay, you seemed disoriented and kept asking her to repeat herself." I had to admire the sophistication of their deception. They'd created a scenario that would be almost impossible for me to disprove. Who could say definitively what had or hadn't happened during a brief conversation with a neighbor? They'd chosen details that sounded plausible while being completely fabricated. The kind of story that would convince a judge or social worker that my family's concerns were legitimate rather than manufactured. "I remember speaking with Mrs. Patterson briefly," I said carefully, "but I was perfectly coherent. I was checking my garden for frost damage after the cold snap we had Sunday night. I was wearing my robe because I'd just gotten up and noticed ice on my tomato plants." "See, that's exactly what worries us," Emily said, and I could see genuine concern in her expression. Not for my well-being, but for whether I was buying their story. "You remember parts of it, but you're confused about the details. Mrs. Patterson said it was Tuesday morning, not Sunday night, and she was very specific about your behavior." Vanessa joined the conversation with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd rehearsed her role in this intervention. "We're not trying to upset you, Judith. We love you, and we want to make sure you're safe. That's all any of us want, for you to be safe and comfortable and well cared for." Daniel nodded in agreement, though his contribution felt mechanical, like he was fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine concern. "The retirement communities we've researched really are wonderful. You'd have your own space, but with medical care available if you need it, and social activities to keep you engaged with people your own age." People your own age. As if my current life was somehow deficient because I chose to live independently, rather than surrounded by other elderly people warehoused together for the convenience of their families. As if reaching 67 automatically meant I needed to be segregated from the broader community and supervised by medical professionals. "I appreciate your concern," I said, setting down my teacup with deliberate precision, "but I feel quite capable of recognizing my own limitations. When and if I need additional care, I'll make arrangements myself. For now, I'm comfortable and safe in my own home." "But that's just it, Mom," Gar said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone adults use with children who don't understand what's best for them. "Sometimes people who are experiencing cognitive changes aren't aware of those changes. That's why we think it would be good for you to have a professional evaluation, just to establish a baseline for your mental health." Professional evaluation. The psychiatric assessment with Dr. Phillips that I'd already canceled. The rigged examination designed to provide legal justification for declaring me incompetent. They were still pushing forward with their timeline, apparently unaware that I'd discovered their plan and taken steps to protect myself. "I've been thinking about that," I said, and watched their faces brighten with what they mistook for compliance. In fact, I've already made an appointment with Dr. Harrison at Northwestern Memorial for a comprehensive neurological evaluation. He's one of the most respected geriatric neurologists in the city. The change in their expressions was subtle but unmistakable. Disappointment quickly masked by forced enthusiasm. They'd wanted me to see their corrupted psychiatrist, not a legitimate medical professional who would actually assess my mental state rather than rubber stamp their predetermined conclusion. "That's wonderful, Mom," Emily said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "When is your appointment?" "Next Thursday," I lied smoothly, knowing that the specific timing didn't matter since I had no intention of keeping them informed about my actual medical decisions. "Dr. Harrison comes highly recommended by my primary care physician." What happened next revealed the depth of their desperation and the completeness of their conspiracy. Little Lily, who had been quietly coloring at the end of the table while the adults talked, suddenly looked up and said, "Grandma, are you really sick? Mommy and Daddy have been talking about how you might have to go live somewhere else because your brain isn't working right anymore." The innocent honesty of a child cut through their careful facade like a sword through silk. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth they'd been hiding behind euphemisms and false concern. They'd been discussing my supposed mental illness in front of my granddaughter, poisoning her perception of me before she was old enough to understand the difference between truth and manipulation. Emily's face flushed red as she quickly tried to minimize the damage. "Lily, we've talked about this. Grandma isn't sick. We're just making sure she has everything she needs to be happy and healthy." But the damage was done. I looked at my granddaughter's confused face and saw the questions in her eyes. The uncertainty about whether her grandmother was still the same person who read her stories and helped her with homework. They'd already begun the process of alienating her from me, preparing her to accept my absence when they succeeded in having me institutionalized. "Lily, sweetheart," I said gently, "my brain is working just fine. Sometimes adults worry about things that aren't really problems. I'm not going anywhere unless I choose to go somewhere." The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of my grandmother's clock on the mantelpiece and the nearly inaudible hum of the recording devices capturing every moment of this confrontation. I could see the adults exchanging glances, having rapid nonverbal conversations about how to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from them. Finally, Gar decided to abandon subtlety entirely. "Mom, we've already put down a deposit at Sunset Manor. They have a beautiful one-bedroom unit available, and we've filled out all the paperwork. All you need to do is sign the admission forms, and you could move in next week." There it was, the ultimatum delivered with a smile, the illusion of choice in what was actually a demand for surrender. They'd already spent my money, already made arrangements for my life, already decided my future without consulting me. All that remained was for me to comply with their decision like an obedient child accepting punishment for misbehavior I hadn't committed. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled, and walked to the window where I could see the garden Erwin and I had planted together 40 years ago. The autumn flowers were still blooming despite the recent cold snap, purple asters and yellow mums that had survived because I'd covered them with sheets during the worst of the frost, because I'd cared enough to protect something beautiful from destruction. "I need you all to listen very carefully," I said, turning back to face the people who shared my blood but no longer shared my love. "I am not moving to Sunset Manor. I am not signing any paperwork. I am not submitting to any psychiatric evaluations arranged by this family. And I am not going to pretend anymore that what you're doing is motivated by love or concern for my welfare." The silence that followed was electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes either violence or revelation. I could see them processing my words, trying to understand how their compliant victim had suddenly developed a spine, how their carefully orchestrated intervention had transformed into open defiance. "Mom," Emily said carefully, "you're getting upset, and that's not helping anyone. Maybe we should table this discussion for another time, when you've had a chance to think about everything we've said." "I've done nothing but think," I replied, my voice carrying the authority I'd once used in operating rooms when life and death decisions needed to be made quickly and decisively. "I've thought about the birthday party that was really a setup for another financial request. I've thought about the psychiatric evaluation you arranged without my knowledge. I've thought about the retirement home deposit you made without my consent. And I've thought about Mrs. Patterson, who hasn't spoken to me in 3 years and certainly doesn't have your phone numbers. I watched their faces as each revelation hit home, as they realized their careful deceptions were unraveling one by one. But I wasn't finished. I'd spent too many years accepting their manipulation, forgiving their greed, making excuses for their cruelty. Tonight, in front of cameras that would preserve this moment forever, I was going to speak the truth they'd never wanted to hear. I know exactly what you're trying to do, I continued, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging in my chest. And I know exactly why you're trying to do it. This isn't about my safety, or my health, or my well-being. This is about $400,000 in real estate and whatever you can liquidate from my investment accounts. This is about greed, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of family concern. The mask finally slipped completely from Gar's face, revealing the cold calculation beneath his practiced charm. Fine, Mom. You want to be difficult? You want to fight us? Go ahead. But you should understand that we have documentation of your mental decline. Professional opinions about your fitness to manage your own affairs. You can resist all you want, but the courts will side with the children who are trying to protect their mother from her own poor judgment. There it was. The threat delivered without pretense. The promise of legal warfare if I didn't submit voluntarily to their control. They were prepared to destroy me in court, to parade fabricated evidence of my incompetence before judges and juries, to publicly humiliate me if that's what it took to seize my assets. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their planning, one oversight that was about to cost them everything they'd worked toward. They'd underestimated their mother. I walked to my bookshelf with the measured pace of someone who had finally found her footing after months of stumbling in the dark. My hands were steady as I reached behind the medical textbooks where I'd hidden the small recording device, the one that had been capturing every word of their conspiracy for the past hour and 17 minutes. You're absolutely right, Gar, I said, holding up the device so they could all see it clearly. Documentation is everything. Professional opinions matter. Evidence is crucial when you're trying to prove someone's mental competence or incompetence. The color drained from his face as he stared at the recorder, understanding dawning in his eyes like sunrise after the darkest night. Emily's mouth fell open, her lawyer's mind immediately calculating the legal implications of what she was seeing. Vanessa grabbed Daniel's arm, and I watched him swallow hard as he realized their carefully planned fraud had just been exposed in real time. This device has been recording our entire conversation tonight, I continued, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd once used to deliver life-changing diagnoses to patients and their families. It captured your fabricated story about Mrs. Patterson. It recorded your admission that you've already put down deposits and filled out paperwork without my knowledge or consent. It documented your threat to use falsified medical records to have me declared incompetent. I set the recorder on my coffee table where they could all see its small red light blinking steadily, a technological heartbeat that had been documenting their destruction of everything I'd thought sacred about family relationships. But that's not all, I said, feeling strength flow through me like medicine through an IV line, healing and empowering simultaneously. There are cameras throughout this house that have been recording both video and audio since you arrived. Every smile, every lie, every calculated expression of false concern. All of it preserved in high-definition digital files that are automatically backed up to secure cloud storage. Emily found her voice first, though it came out as a whisper rather than her usual confident tone. Mom, you can't record people without their consent. In Illinois, that's illegal. Anything you've captured tonight would be inadmissible in court. Actually, dear, I replied, savoring the irony of correcting my lawyer daughter on legal matters, Illinois is a one-party consent state for recordings made in private residences. Since I'm a party to this conversation and we're in my home, everything I've recorded is perfectly legal and completely admissible. But you would know that if you'd been honest about your intentions instead of assuming I was too confused to protect myself. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of little Lily's crayons moving across her coloring book as she continued her artwork. blissfully unaware that the adult world around her was collapsing into chaos and recrimination. Furthermore, I continued, reaching into my purse for the folder Marcus Chen had given me, I've already consulted with an attorney who specializes in elder abuse cases. Marcus Chen of Morrison and Associates has reviewed the evidence I've collected over the past week, and he's prepared to file criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and elder financial abuse if necessary. I opened the folder and began reading from the documents inside, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. I've also discovered some interesting information about your various personal situations that explains your sudden desperation for immediate access to my assets. Daniel's face went white as paper, and I saw him exchange a panicked glance with Vanessa. They knew what was coming, knew that their secrets were about to be exposed just as thoroughly as they'd planned to expose my fabricated mental incompetence. Daniel, did you really think your embezzlement at Morrison Accounting would remain hidden forever? My attorney's investigator found evidence of at least $40,000 in client funds that you've diverted to cover gambling debts. Your firm hasn't discovered it yet, but they will soon enough. Daniel started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. I wasn't finished dismantling their carefully constructed lives, wasn't done revealing the desperation that had driven them to target their own mother as a source of salvation from their self-created problems. Vanessa, your affair with your husband's supervisor at the pharmaceutical company is documented in hotel receipts, credit card statements, and approximately 24 text messages that your lover's wife provided to my investigator. Apparently, she's planning to file for divorce and name you as co-respondent, which will probably cost Gar his job when the company decides they don't want that kind of scandal associated with their sales department. Vanessa's carefully maintained composure cracked completely, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full scope of her exposure. Gar stared at his wife with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, understanding that his marriage and his career were both built on foundations that were already crumbling. And Emily, I said, turning to my daughter with a mixture of sadness and steel in my voice. Your law firm is currently under investigation by the State Bar Association for overbilling clients and maintaining fraudulent trust accounts. Your name appears on 17 different incidents that could result in suspension or disbarment. No wonder you've been so eager to access my assets. You need money for legal fees and potential restitution payments. The room felt like a courtroom where verdicts were being delivered, where carefully hidden truths were finally being spoken aloud and forcing everyone to confront the reality of who they'd become. My children and their spouses sat frozen in their chairs, each one calculating how much damage had been done to their carefully maintained facades. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You're going to cancel the deposit at Sunset Manor and request a full refund. You're going to inform Dr. Phillips that his services won't be needed for any evaluations of my mental state. You're going to stop spreading lies about my cognitive abilities to neighbors, friends, medical professionals, or anyone else who will listen. I walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain, revealing the police car that had been parked across the street for the past 20 minutes. Officer Martinez is waiting outside in case any of you decide to become aggressive or threatening when you realize that your conspiracy has been completely exposed. He's a family friend from our church, and he's aware of the situation we're dealing with tonight. Gar found his voice, though it came out strained and desperate. Mom, please, you don't understand. We're in real trouble here. We need help, and you're the only family we have. We weren't trying to hurt you. We were trying to save ourselves. By destroying me, I replied simply. By stealing my home, my independence, my dignity, and my freedom. By having me declared mentally incompetent and locked away in an institution so you could liquidate my life's work to pay for your bad decisions and criminal behavior. Emily stood up abruptly, her lawyer instincts finally kicking in as she realized the legal jeopardy they were all facing. We need to leave. Now. Before this gets any worse. It's already as bad as it can get, I said quietly. The question now is whether you're going to accept responsibility for what you've done and try to make amends, or whether you're going to compound your crimes by continuing to lie and threaten and manipulate. I picked up my Bible from the side table where it had been resting throughout this entire confrontation, my fingers finding comfort in its familiar weight and texture. "I've been praying about this situation every day since I discovered what you were planning. Not praying for revenge, but praying for wisdom. Not asking God to punish you, but asking Him to help me find a way to forgive you." The words felt strange in my mouth after everything that had been said and revealed, but they were true. Despite the betrayal, despite the calculated cruelty, despite the complete absence of genuine love in their treatment of me, some part of my heart still hoped for redemption rather than destruction. "I forgive you," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I forgive you for the lies, the manipulation, the conspiracy, the complete disregard for my humanity and dignity. But I will not enable you anymore. I will not fund your bad decisions, pay for your mistakes, or allow you to treat me like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be loved." Vanessa was crying openly now, mascara streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her affair and her plans for financial security had both been exposed simultaneously. Daniel sat with his head in his hands, probably calculating how much prison time embezzlement charges might carry. Gar and Emily stared at each other with the expressions of conspirators whose plans had not just failed, but backfired spectacularly. "This is your chance to leave with whatever dignity you have left," I continued. "Take your daughter, get your lives in order, face the consequences of your actions with whatever courage you can muster. But do it without involving me, without using me, without treating me like an obstacle to be removed or a problem to be solved." Little Lily looked up from her coloring book for the first time since the confrontation began, her innocent eyes taking in the tears and tension that surrounded her. "Grandma, why is everyone crying? Did I do something wrong?" My heart broke for her in that moment, for the confusion and fear that adult selfishness and cruelty had brought into her young life. She didn't understand that the adults who were supposed to protect her had been planning to betray the grandmother who loved her unconditionally. "No, sweetheart," I said gently, kneeling down beside her chair and smoothing her hair with the same tenderness I'd shown her parents when they were small and innocent, and still capable of loving without calculation. "You didn't do anything wrong. The adults are having a disagreement about some grown-up things, but it has nothing to do with you." I looked up at Emily, who was watching this interaction with something that might have been regret or might have been strategic calculation. I could no longer tell the difference. "I want to continue having a relationship with my granddaughter. That's not negotiable. Whatever happens between us, Lily deserves to know her grandmother without the poison of adult conflicts contaminating that relationship." Emily nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing that cooperation on this point might be her only hope of avoiding complete legal disaster. "Of course, Mom. Of course Lily can continue visiting you." They gathered their belongings in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the hollow shock of people whose carefully laid plans had exploded in their faces. As they prepared to leave, I felt a mixture of triumph and devastation that left me emotionally exhausted, but spiritually cleansed. "One more thing," I said as they reached the front door. "I'll be praying for all of you. Not because you deserve it, but because that's what Jesus calls us to do for people who have wronged us. I'll be praying that you find whatever redemption is possible from the wreckage you've made of your lives." After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the debris of a family dinner that had turned into a war zone, listening to the silence that felt different from the loneliness I'd grown accustomed to. This was the silence of peace rather than abandonment, of clarity rather than confusion, of strength rather than weakness. For the first time in months, I felt truly free.